somewhere along the bayous of Louisiana, in a parish whose exact location has been deliberately obscured from historical records, there exists a documented account that challenges everything we understand about survival, will, and the boundaries between human and animal nature. Court documents from 1847 reference an incident involving 8 hunting dogs, a locked cellar, and a young woman who emerged after 72 hours not as a victim, but as something the local magistrate described only as possessing an authority I cannot explain and dare not question. The plantation where this occurred was burned to the ground within a week of the incident, its ashes scattered, its records destroyed. Yet 3 separate letters from neighboring estate owners, now housed in a private collection in Baton Rouge, describe the same impossible scene. A girl of no more than 19 years, walking calmly through the main gates at dawn, 8 massive hunting dogs following in perfect formation behind her, their eyes fixed on her back with what one witness called the devotion of disciples. The Baroness, who owned both the girl and the dogs, was found dead in her chambers that same morning, though the cause was officially recorded as heart failure. What happened in that cellar was never officially investigated, never publicly discussed, and deliberately erased from parish records. Until now, the full account has remained buried in fragments across Louisiana's forgotten archives. Before we continue with the story of what transpired on the Devereaux estate in St. Landry Parish, I need you to do something. If this introduction alone has sent a chill down your spine, hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this, stories that blur the line between documented history and inexplicable events, are what we bring you every week. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know where in America our community of mystery seekers is growing. Now let's discover what really happened in that cellar, and why the truth was worth destroying every record of its existence. The events that would forever stain the Devereaux name began not with the girl or the dogs, but with the arrival of a widow to Louisiana's sugar country. St. Landry Parish in the 1840s existed as a patchwork of old French colonial pride and new American ambition, where the rhythms of sugarcane cultivation dictated everything from marriage prospects to social standing. The parish stretched across fertile lowlands, where cypress swamps gave way to endless rows of cane, and the air hung perpetually thick with moisture that made wool clothes cling and tempers flare. This was Acadian country, where French remained the language of choice among established families, where Catholic saints watched from every mantelpiece, and where the old ways of doing things, the brutal mathematics of plantation economics, went largely unquestioned by those who profited from them. The town of Opelousas served as the parish seat, a modest collection of buildings arranged around a central square where the courthouse stood, its columns already showing signs of decay despite being less than 20 years old. On Saturdays, this square filled with planters' wives examining fabric from New Orleans, enslaved people moving between errands under the watchful eyes of overseers, and occasionally traveling preachers warning of judgment and damnation. But the real power in St. Landry didn't reside in Opelousas. It lived on the estates that spread like kingdoms across the surrounding countryside, each one a world unto itself, governed by whoever held the deed. The Devereaux estate sat 7 miles northwest of town, accessible only by a shell road that became impassable in heavy rain. The property had originally belonged to the Fontenot family, prosperous French Creoles who'd built their fortune through careful marriages and ruthless efficiency. When the last Fontenot heir died without children in 1843, the estate passed through a complicated series of transactions that left it in the hands of a woman few in the parish had ever met. Baroness Eloise Devereaux arrived in Louisiana in April of 1844, traveling from Charleston with a retinue of servants, several trunks of European furnishings, and a reputation that had preceded her by several months. She was widow to a minor Belgian noble, whose death, rumors suggested, had been financially convenient for the Baroness. She was perhaps 40 years old, though she dressed younger, favoring expensive fabrics in colors that drew attention. Her face bore the type of beauty that had begun to harden at its edges, the kind that required constant maintenance and resented any reminder of time's passage. What struck people about the Baroness wasn't her appearance, but her eyes. They carried a calculating quality, a coldness that seemed to assess the monetary value of everything they landed upon. She spoke French with a Walloon accent, English with precision, and the local Creole dialect not at all, which she made clear was beneath her station. Within weeks of her arrival, she dismissed half the estate's workers, replaced the overseer with a man named Gaspard Thibault, who'd been fired from 3 previous positions for excessive cruelty, and instituted a system of discipline that made neighboring planters, men hardly known for gentleness, exchange uncomfortable glances. The Baroness had brought with her from Charleston 8 hunting dogs, massive beasts bred from mastiffs and bloodhounds, each standing nearly 3 feet at the shoulder. She'd had them trained, she informed the local gentry at a dinner party that first summer, by a man in South Carolina who specialized in dogs of intimidation. They were never to be pets, she explained. They were tools, instruments of control, bred and conditioned to respond to fear, to dominate through size and the constant implicit threat of violence. She kept them in a specially constructed kennel behind the main house, fed them on a precise schedule designed to keep them perpetually hungry, perpetually alert, perpetually dangerous. The Baroness named each dog after a European noble house: Bourbon, Savoy, Habsburg, Hohenzollern, Romanov, Windsor, Grimaldi, and Medici. She found it amusing, she told her guests, to have aristocratic bloodlines serving her will. The dogs responded only to her commands, spoken in sharp German. To everyone else, including Thibault, they showed teeth. In the fall of 1844, the Baroness purchased a girl at the New Orleans slave market. The transaction was documented in a ledger that still exists, though the girl's name was recorded only as female, age estimated 16, from Virginia estate sale. The broker's notes, written in margins, described her as uncommonly defiant for her age. Previous owner reported incidents of disobedience. Reduced price reflects difficult temperament. The Baroness paid $400, a significant discount from market rate, and had the girl transported to St. Landry in chains. The girl received the name Marguerite on the plantation, though this wasn't the name she'd carried from Virginia. The Baroness chose it because it sounded civilized, because it was easy to call out, because the girl's actual name, her mother's name, was none of the Baroness's concern. Marguerite stood perhaps 5 feet 4 inches, with the kind of slender build that came from growth interrupted by insufficient food. Her hands showed calluses from field work, but her previous owner's notes indicated she'd been training as a house servant before an unspecified incident led to her sale. What made Marguerite different, what had likely caused her problems in Virginia, was her eyes. They didn't drop when addressed by white people. They didn't show the fear that planters expected and required. They watched, they calculated, they held to intelligence that made overseers uncomfortable. The Baroness saw this quality immediately and found it entertaining. Here was something to break, something that would make the breaking satisfying. Marguerite's first assignment was in the main house, cleaning rooms and serving meals. The Baroness watched her constantly during these early weeks, looking for any mistake, any opportunity to assert dominance. She found it in late November, when Marguerite failed to curtsy quickly enough after receiving an instruction. The punishment was 20 lashes in the yard, administered by Thibault while the household staff watched. Marguerite took the whipping in silence. Her face turned to the side, her jaw clenched so tightly that blood showed where she'd bitten the inside of her cheek. The silence, the refusal to scream or beg, infuriated the Baroness more than defiance would have. Over the following months, a pattern emerged. The Baroness would assign impossible tasks, then punish Marguerite for failing to complete them. She would plant items in Marguerite's quarters, then accuse her of theft. She would change instructions after giving them, then rage at the girl's incompetence. The other enslaved people on the estate learned to avoid Marguerite, understanding that proximity to the Baroness's fixation meant danger. Thibault began making jokes about how long the girl would last, whether her spirit would break before her body gave out. But Marguerite didn't break. She bent, she endured, but something in her remained rigid, untouched. The Baroness could see it in those eyes, still watching, still calculating, still containing something that refused to be extinguished. It became an obsession for the Baroness, this one slave who wouldn't properly submit, who somehow maintained a core of selfhood despite everything. In March of 1845, the Baroness's husband from a previous marriage, a detail she'd never shared, arrived unexpectedly from Charleston. He stayed 2 weeks, during which the Baroness's mood improved significantly. She barely acknowledged Marguerite's existence during this period, focused instead on entertaining her guest. The household staff whispered that perhaps the Baroness would return to Charleston, perhaps they'd all be sold to someone less cruel. Then the visitor left, and something in the Baroness darkened permanently. Gaspard Thibault, who kept meticulous records of the estate's operations, noted in his journal that April 1845 marked a shift in the Baroness's behavior. She began spending hours in the dog kennels, training the animals herself, developing commands and responses. She reduced their feeding schedule, keeping them in a state of controlled starvation that made them more aggressive, more desperate. She had Thibault construct a cellar beneath the kennels, a space 8 feet square with a packed earth floor and walls of cypress board. The cellar had one entrance, accessed through a trap door in the kennel floor, and no windows. Its purpose wasn't explained. Marguerite continued her work in the main house, now almost invisible to the Baroness, who seemed to have forgotten her previous fixation. Other staff members relaxed slightly, hoping the worst had passed. Marguerite herself said nothing, her face showing neither relief nor concern. She simply continued day after day, surviving. Then came the incident with the silver. May 17, 1847, dawned humid and grey, the kind of spring morning where the air felt like breathing through damp cloth. Marguerite rose before dawn as always and began her morning duties, emptying chamber pots, laying fires in the downstairs rooms, preparing the breakfast service. The main house stood quiet, except for the usual sounds of an estate waking, the distant calls of roosters, the creak of boards settling, the soft footsteps of other servants beginning their routines. The Baroness rarely appeared before 9, which gave the household staff a few hours of relative peace each morning. Marguerite moved through her tasks with practiced efficiency, her mind likely already planning the day's remaining work. She'd learned through painful experience to anticipate the Baroness's wants, to complete tasks before being asked, to make herself useful enough to avoid notice, but never so accomplished as to inspire resentment. At 8:30, while polishing silver in the dining room, Marguerite heard the Baroness's bedroom door open upstairs, earlier than usual. Footsteps crossed the upper hallway, then descended the stairs with unusual speed. The Baroness appeared in the dining room doorway still in her dressing gown, her hair unpinned, her face twisted with an expression that Marguerite had learned meant danger. "Where is it?" The Baroness's voice came out quiet, controlled, which was somehow worse than screaming. Marguerite set down the silver spoon she'd been polishing and stood, her eyes dropping to the floor as protocol demanded. "Ma'am, my bracelet. The gold bracelet with sapphires. It was on my nightstand last night. This morning it's gone." The Baroness moved into the room, circling Marguerite slowly. "You were in my chambers yesterday afternoon, changing linens." "Yes, ma'am. I didn't see any bracelet." "You didn't see it, or you saw it and took it?" "I didn't take anything, ma'am." The Baroness completed her circle, standing now between Marguerite and the doorway. "Empty your pockets." Marguerite did, pulling out the inside of her apron pockets to show they contained nothing but a rag and a small piece of soap. The Baroness watched, her jaw working slightly, as if chewing something distasteful. "Your quarters, then." "We'll search your quarters." The search took less than 5 minutes. The room Marguerite shared with 2 other house servants contained almost nothing beyond sleeping pallets and a few changes of clothes. The bracelet wasn't there. The Baroness stood in the doorway, her face reddening, her hands opening and closing at her sides. Thibaut, the call echoed through the house. The overseer appeared within seconds, a slight man with thinning hair and permanently sunburned skin. He carried a riding crop, always more as affectation than tool, slapping it against his leg as he walked. "Take her to the yard." 20 lashes for theft. "Ma'am, I didn't." The Baroness's hand shot out, catching Marguerite across the mouth. "Don't speak. Don't you dare speak." Marguerite tasted blood where her lips split against her teeth. She kept her eyes down, her body still, waiting. "Actually, no." The Baroness's voice changed, taking on a thoughtful quality that was somehow more frightening than her anger. "No, I have something better in mind. Thibaut, take her to the cellars. Lock her in the lower room." Thibault's eyebrows rose slightly. "The room under the kennels, ma'am?" "Yes." "For how long?" The Baroness smiled, an expression that never reached her eyes. "Until I decide she's learned proper respect. A day, perhaps 2. Let her think about her theft in the dark. Let her listen to the dogs above her and contemplate what happens to thieves on my estate." Thibaut nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." "Should I bring her food?" "No food. Water twice daily, that's all. I want her hungry when I decide to let her out. I want her to understand what deprivation truly means." They took Marguerite across the grounds to the kennel building, a long, low structure that housed the 8 hunting dogs in individual runs. The animals started barking as soon as the door opened, a thunderous cacophony that echoed off the walls. The dogs threw themselves against their gates, massive bodies creating impacts that shook the wooden structure. Thibaut led Marguerite to the far end of the building, where a trapdoor sat in the floor, secured with an iron padlock. "Down you go." Thibaut unlocked the padlock, lifting the door to reveal a wooden ladder descending into darkness. The smell that rose from below, earth and old wood and something else, something animal and sour, made Marguerite's stomach turn. She climbed down. The ladder descended perhaps 10 feet, depositing her in complete darkness. She heard the trapdoor slam shut above, then the click of the padlock securing it. Thibault's boots walked away across the floor above. The dogs continued barking for several more minutes, then gradually quieted. The cellar, as Marguerite's eyes adjusted to the minimal light bleeding through cracks in the floorboards above, proved to be exactly what Thibaut had described. 8 feet square, maybe 7 feet tall at the center, where the ceiling peaked. The floor was packed earth, cool and slightly damp. The walls were rough cypress boards, fitted tightly enough that no light penetrated from outside. The only ventilation came through the gaps in the floorboards above, bringing with it the smell of the dogs and the occasional drift of dust or straw. A wooden bucket sat in one corner, presumably for Marguerite's waste. Nothing else occupied the space. No blanket, no pallet, no source of light, just earth and wood and darkness. Marguerite sat with her back against one wall, her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around her legs. Her lip still bled slightly from where the Baroness had struck her. She could hear the dogs above, their breathing, their occasional movements, the scrape of claws on wood. Sometimes one would bark, and the others would join briefly before falling silent again. She'd been in worse places. In Virginia, before the sale, they'd locked her in a smokehouse for 3 days after she'd talked back to the overseer's wife. This cellar was bigger than the smokehouse, and at least it wasn't summer. She could endure a day, maybe 2. The Baroness would eventually grow bored of the punishment, would want her back working rather than sitting idle in the dark. What Marguerite didn't know, couldn't know, was that the Baroness had no intention of letting her out in a day or 2. The first 24 hours passed in a fog of discomfort rather than crisis. Thibault brought water at dawn and dusk, lowering a cup on a string without saying anything, waiting while Marguerite drank, then pulling the cup back up. The dogs learned to ignore her presence below them, settling into their routines. Marguerite dozed when she could, her body adapting to the hard ground, her mind deliberately empty of thought. The second day brought hunger, real hunger. Not just the usual background ache of insufficient food, but a gnawing emptiness that made her stomach cramp. The darkness began to feel heavier, more oppressive. Time became difficult to judge. She counted Thibault's water deliveries, marking time in 12-hour increments, but the hours between stretched and compressed unpredictably. On the third day, Thibault didn't come. Marguerite waited, listening for his footsteps, hearing nothing but the dogs. Her mouth felt dry as dust, her tongue thick. The hunger had evolved beyond discomfort into something that commanded all her attention. She called out once, her voice cracking, but received no response. The day passed. No water came. That night, the fourth night of her confinement, she heard different footsteps above. Lighter, quicker, accompanied by the rustle of skirts. The Baroness. "Are you thirsty, Marguerite?" The voice came through the floorboards, sweetly mocking. "Are you hungry? Are you ready to confess your theft?" Marguerite didn't respond. Her throat felt too dry for speech, her mind too focused on the physical urgency of her needs. "I found my bracelet this morning. It was behind my dresser, exactly where I must have knocked it days ago. Isn't that interesting? You were innocent all along." A pause, filled with the sound of dogs panting. "But you're still here, aren't you? Because this was never really about the bracelet. This is about you learning your proper place. This is about that look in your eyes, that thing you think I don't see, that tiny spark of defiance you've kept alive despite everything. I'm going to extinguish it, Marguerite. I'm going to leave you down there until there's nothing left but grateful submission." The Baroness's footsteps moved to different positions above, as if she were pacing. "I've decided on an experiment, a test of survival, if you will. The dogs above you haven't been fed in 3 days. They're hungry, desperately hungry as you are right now. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to open that trap door and let them down to you, all 8 of them, starving, trained to dominate, faced with something weak and helpless. Nature will take its course as it always does. The strong will consume the weak. The aristocratic bloodlines will feast on the defiant slave. There's a poetry to it, don't you think?" Marguerite pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Or," the Baroness continued, her voice still carrying that terrible sweetness, "you can save yourself. You can scream and beg and promise me the absolute submission I require. You can sob and plead and offer me the broken spirit I've been trying to extract since you arrived. You have until dawn to decide. After that, the choice won't be yours anymore." The footsteps walked away. A door closed. The dogs above settled into restless silence, occasionally whining or shifting position. Marguerite sat in the darkness, her mind racing through scenarios, through possibilities, through the immediate calculus of survival. 8 starving dogs. A space too small to run, too small to hide. No weapons, no defense, no way to fight or flee. The Baroness was right about one thing: nature would take its course. The dogs would smell her fear, would respond to her helplessness, would do what they'd been trained and bred to do. Unless an idea began forming in Marguerite's mind, built from fragments of observation, from months of watching the Baroness with her dogs, from childhood memories of farm animals and their hierarchies, from a desperate understanding that her only chance lay in attempting something that would seem impossible to anyone who hadn't spent 2 years studying cruelty. The dogs weren't pets. The Baroness had been clear about that. They were tools, instruments, trained to respond to dominance and control. They'd been conditioned to follow strength, to submit to authority, to recognize hierarchy. Their entire existence was built around understanding who held power and who didn't. What if the hierarchy could be disrupted? What if hunger and confinement hadn't just weakened Marguerite, but also the dogs? What if the thing the Baroness had been trying to break in Marguerite, that core of selfhood and will, was the exact thing that could save her? Marguerite spent the remaining hours of darkness preparing. She used her fingers to dig in the packed earth floor, creating a small depression in one corner. She tore strips from her dress, wrapping them around her hands and forearms as makeshift protection. She positioned herself in the center of the cellar, away from the walls, in a spot where she'd have room to move in any direction. She controlled her breathing, forcing her panic down, channeling it into cold focus. Most importantly, she made a decision. When those dogs came down, she wouldn't scream. She wouldn't run or cower or show fear. She would meet them as an equal, as another hungry predator competing for survival, as something that refused to be prey. It was insane. It was impossible. It was her only chance. Dawn light began showing through the cracks above. Marguerite heard the Baroness arrive, heard Thibault with her, heard the gates of the dog runs being opened one by one. The animals began to move, their claws clicking on wood, their breathing heavy with anticipation. They'd been conditioned to associate the opening of gates with food, with the satisfaction of hunger. Today, the Baroness would direct that hunger downward. The padlock clicked. The trapdoor lifted. Before we discover what happened when those 8 starving dogs entered the cellar with Marguerite, I need you to pause and do something. If you're as gripped by this story as I am by telling it, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who appreciates the darkest corners of American history. Comment below with your theories about what happened next. Could a young woman really survive what the Baroness had planned? Could she possibly emerge from that cellar alive? The answer is more disturbing than anything you're imagining. Don't go anywhere, because the truth about what transpired in that Louisiana cellar challenges everything we understand about survival and will. The first dog descended the ladder with surprising grace for its size. Bourbon, the largest of the 8, weighed perhaps 130 pounds. His coat a mottled brown and black. His eyes adapted quickly to the dim light below. He reached the cellar floor and immediately oriented toward Marguerite, his body tensing, his lips pulling back slightly from yellowed teeth. 3 days without food had stripped away any training that conflicted with survival. He was, in that moment, purely animal, purely predator, facing something that smelled like food. Marguerite didn't move. She stood in the center of the cellar, her feet planted, her wrapped hands loose at her sides, her eyes locked on the dog's eyes. Not staring, which would be challenge, but watching, which communicated awareness. The dog circled left. Marguerite turned with him, maintaining the eye contact, keeping her body oriented to face him directly. The second dog came down, Savoy, slightly smaller, faster, more nervous, then Habsburg, then Romanov. Within 2 minutes, all 8 dogs stood in the cellar with Marguerite, their combined mass filling the small space, their breathing loud in the enclosed air. The trapdoor remained open above, the Baroness's face visible in the opening, backlit by morning sun. "She's not even screaming," Marguerite heard Thibault say, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "She will," the Baroness replied. "Give them a moment." The dogs began moving in a pattern Marguerite recognized from months of observation. They were establishing formation, determining hierarchy, deciding which animal would lead the attack. Bourbon remained in front, but Windsor and Grimaldi were moving to flank positions, cutting off potential escape routes that didn't exist anyway in the confined space. Marguerite did something then that would seem incomprehensible to anyone watching from above. She stepped forward, directly toward Bourbon. The dog froze. This wasn't prey behavior. Prey ran, cowered, showed submission. This was something else, something that triggered different instincts. Marguerite took another step, closing the distance to perhaps 4 feet. She could smell the dog now, the sour stench of unwashed fur and desperation. She could see the tension in his muscles, the calculation in his eyes. Then she did something even stranger. She dropped to one knee, lowering herself to the dog's level, making herself smaller, reducing the physical dominance of height. But she kept her eyes level, kept her body oriented forward, kept a quality in her posture that communicated not submission, but equality. She extended one wrapped hand, not as offering or threat, but as acknowledgement, as recognition. Bourbon's head tilted slightly, confused. The other dogs had stopped moving, watching their leader, waiting for the signal to attack. The cellar held perfectly still, except for the sound of breathing. 8 dogs and 1 woman, all hungry, all desperate, all caught in a moment that could break toward violence or something else. Marguerite spoke. Her voice came out rough from days without water, barely above a whisper, but steady. "You're hungry, I'm hungry. We're all hungry. She made us this way." The Baroness laughed from above. "She's lost her mind. The fear has broken her sanity." But Marguerite continued, her words not for the Baroness but for the dogs, for herself, for whatever instinct or intelligence might exist in the space between species. "You've been starved and controlled and made into weapons. You know what it means to be owned. You know what it means to be someone's tool." She shifted her position slightly, still kneeling, moving with slow deliberation toward the corner where she dug the small depression in the earth. The dogs watched, but didn't attack. Bourbon took a step forward, sniffing, his aggression shifting toward curiosity. Marguerite reached the corner and began digging with her wrapped hands, pulling up handfuls of earth, creating a deeper hole. The dogs came closer, intrigued by the activity, their predatory focus disrupted by this strange behavior. She could feel them near her now, their breath on her back, their presence surrounding her. She pulled something from the hole she'd created. A dead rat. The cellar had been home to rodents, as all such buildings were. Marguerite had found this one in the darkness of the first night, already dead, probably killed by poison or a trap. She'd saved it, hidden it, knowing it was pathetically inadequate as any kind of defense, but too desperate to discard any potential tool. Now she held it up, the small corpse dangling from her fingers. 8 pairs of eyes fixed on the rat with laser intensity. Marguerite tore the rat in half with her hands, the action brutal and pragmatic. She threw one piece to the far corner of the cellar. 4 dogs immediately rushed toward it, fighting briefly before Bourbon asserted dominance and claimed the prize, swallowing it in seconds. She threw the second piece to the opposite corner. The remaining dogs competed for it, with Windsor emerging victorious. The whole exchange took perhaps 30 seconds. When it was over, all 8 dogs turned back to Marguerite, still hungry, but now with a new association forming in their simple minds. This 2-legged creature had provided food. This creature had addressed their hunger, however inadequately. This creature might provide again. "That won't save you," the Baroness called down. "1 rat divided among 9. All you've done is give them a taste of meat. Now they'll want more." But something had shifted in the cellar's dynamic. Marguerite sat down slowly, her back against the wall, her body deliberately relaxed despite her hammering heart. The dogs approached, sniffing her aggressively, their noses pushing against her arms, her legs, her face. She didn't flinch. She didn't resist. She let them investigate. Let them learn her scent without the overlay of fear. Let them reach their own conclusions about whether she was food or something else. Bourbon pushed his massive head against her chest, nearly knocking her over. She steadied herself, and moving very slowly, brought one wrapped hand up to scratch behind his ears. The dog's tail, which had been rigid, gave a single uncertain wag. The ears, which had been pinned back, relaxed slightly forward. The other dogs, seeing their leader's response, crowded closer. Marguerite sat surrounded by 8 starving animals, each one capable of killing her in seconds, each one conditioned by the Baroness to dominate through intimidation. But in that moment, they weren't attacking. They were confused, uncertain, responding to something in Marguerite's bearing that didn't match their training. "This is impossible." Thibault's voice drifted down. "They should have torn her apart by now." "Give them time," the Baroness said, but her voice carried less certainty than before. The hours that followed would later be described by Thibault in his journal as contrary to every natural law and principle of animal behavior I have witnessed in 30 years of handling hounds. The dogs didn't attack. They settled around Marguerite in the cellar, their bodies pressed against hers for warmth, their hunger not forgotten, but subordinated to pack dynamics that were rewriting themselves in real time. Marguerite spoke to them throughout the morning, her voice steady despite her own hunger and thirst, her words meaningless in content, but important in tone. She established herself not as master, not as servant, but as pack member, as fellow survivor, as creature equally trapped by the Baroness's cruelty. The dogs, bred and trained to respond to dominance, found themselves responding instead to something they'd never encountered: solidarity. The Baroness watched for hours, her face above showing increasing frustration. She called down commands in German, sharp words that should have triggered the dogs' training. They ignored her. She threw food down at midday, dried meat that should have caused a feeding frenzy. The dogs ate in an orderly fashion, and Bourbon brought a piece to Marguerite, dropping it at her feet. How is she doing this? The Baroness's voice carried genuine bewilderment now, mixed with rising anger. Thibault had no answer. Neither did any of the household staff who'd gathered to watch, drawn by rumors of something impossible occurring in the kennels. As the afternoon progressed, Marguerite began moving around the cellar in slow, deliberate patterns. The dogs moved with her, following, their formation shifting from predatory to protective. When she approached the ladder, they positioned themselves behind her. When she sat, they formed a circle around her. Their loyalty to the Baroness, built through years of conditioning and fear, was dissolving under the reality of shared imprisonment and shared hunger. By evening of that first day, the dynamic had completely inverted from what the Baroness intended. The dogs weren't threatening Marguerite, they were protecting her. The Baroness, faced with the failure of her experiment and the humiliation of having her control challenged by someone she considered beneath consideration, made a decision that would prove fatal. She ordered Thibault to descend into the cellar and retrieve Marguerite, to separate her from the dogs by force, to reassert the proper order of things. Thibault, to his credit, recognized the insanity of this order. "Ma'am, those dogs will attack anyone who approaches her now. They've bonded to her in some way I don't understand, but I understand that going down there would be suicide." "Then bring the dogs up, bring them up, and we'll separate them from her. They won't come up without her. Look at them." And it was true. When Thibault called the dogs from above, using the commands they'd been trained to obey, not one of them moved. They stayed with Marguerite, their eyes fixed on her, their bodies positioned between her and any threat from above. The Baroness's face, visible in the trap-door opening, went through a series of expressions: confusion, anger, disbelief, and finally something darker, something that resembled true hatred. This slave, this property, this thing she'd purchased for $400 had accomplished something the Baroness couldn't. Absolute loyalty from creatures bred to know only fear and dominance. "Fine," the Baroness said finally. "We'll wait. We'll wait until she's too weak to maintain whatever spell she's cast on them. We'll wait until hunger breaks this absurd alliance. We'll wait until nature reasserts itself and they remember what they are." She closed the trapdoor. The padlock clicked. In the darkness below, Marguerite sat with 8 dogs pressed against her, sharing body heat, sharing breath, sharing the experience of being the Baroness's tools of cruelty. She knew the Baroness would bring no more food, no more water. She knew the plan was to starve them all, to force the dogs to choose between loyalty and survival. She had bought herself time, had created an impossible alliance, but unless something changed, they would all die in this cellar. The question became, how long could survival instinct be held at bay by pack loyalty? How long before hunger would override whatever bond Marguerite had created? The answer, as it turned out, was 72 hours. 3 days in which the Baroness waited for screams that never came, for sounds of violence that never emerged. 3 days in which Thibault brought reports of silence from below, of occasional movement, of dogs that should be maddened by starvation, but seemed instead to be conserving energy. 3 days in which the Baroness's certainty began to crack. On the morning of the 4th day, May 21st, 1847, the Baroness made her final mistake. The decision to open the trapdoor on the 4th morning came not from strategy, but from desperation. The Baroness had spent 3 sleepless nights in her chambers, listening to the silence from the kennels, unable to comprehend how her perfect punishment had transformed into something else. She'd sent Thibault to press his ear against the floorboards multiple times, demanding to know what he heard. His reports never satisfied her. Movement, breathing, the occasional whine or bark, But no violence, no feeding frenzy, no sounds of her will being enacted. The household staff had begun whispering. Not loudly, not openly, but in the corners of rooms and the spaces between duties, they exchanged glances that communicated disbelief and something approaching awe. The girl in the cellar had survived 4 days with 8 starving dogs. The girl who should have been torn apart in minutes had somehow created an alliance that defied everything anyone understood about predators and prey. The Baroness couldn't tolerate it. Not the survival itself, which was disturbing enough, but the way her authority had been undermined, her judgment questioned, her power made to seem impotent. So on the morning of May 21st, she ordered Thibaut to assemble the male house staff, 5 men total, and arm them with long poles used for managing dangerous animals. She would open the trap door, she announced, and the men would separate the girl from the dogs using force if necessary. The animals would be brought up one by one, secured in their individual runs, and then Marguerite would be retrieved and punished properly for whatever sorcery she'd employed. Thibaut tried one more time to dissuade her. "Ma'am, those dogs have been starving for a week. If we agitate them now, there's no predicting what they'll do. They're animals," the Baroness snapped. "They follow strength and they fear pain. We'll remind them of both." The men gathered in the kennel building at dawn. The morning air carried the thickness of impending rain, the kind of heavy humidity that made clothes stick and tempers flare. The Baroness stood beside the trapdoor, dressed in riding clothes as if she were heading out for a pleasant morning hunt rather than confronting the consequences of her cruelty. She held a pistol in her right hand, more for show than practical purpose, since firing it in the confined space would be suicide. "Open it," she commanded. Thibaut unlocked the padlock and lifted the trapdoor. The smell that rose from below made several of the assembled men step back. Stale air, waste, and the concentrated scent of dogs and human confinement. Light spilled down into the cellar, illuminating a scene that made no sense to anyone watching. Marguerite sat in the center of the space, her back straight despite obvious weakness, her clothes filthy and torn, her face gaunt from days without food. The 8 dogs lay around her in a perfect circle, their bodies touching hers and each other's, creating a living barrier. All 16 eyes, human and canine, looked up at the opening above with identical expressions. Not fear, not submission, but something closer to defiance. "Marguerite," the Baroness called down, her voice taking on the sweet, dangerous tone that everyone in her household had learned to fear. "It's time to come up. Your punishment is over. Come up now and we'll forget this entire unfortunate incident." Marguerite didn't respond. She didn't move. Her eyes fixed on the Baroness's face with an intensity that made the older woman's smile falter. "I said come up. That's an order." Still nothing. The dogs stirred slightly, their bodies tensing, responding to the threatening tone in the Baroness's voice. The Baroness's composure cracked. "You will obey me. I own you. I own your life, your body, your very breath. You will climb this ladder immediately, or I will have you dragged up and beaten until you can't stand." Marguerite spoke then, her voice rough from disuse and dehydration, but carrying clearly in the silent building. "No." The single word hung in the air like a gunshot. The assembled men exchanged glances. The Baroness's face went from red to white, her hand tightening on the pistol. "What did you say?" "No, I'm not coming up alone. We're coming up together, all 9 of us, or we're staying down here. You don't give orders anymore, not to me, and not to them." It was the most direct defiance the Baroness had faced in her adult life. She'd built her existence on the absolute certainty of her superiority, her control, her right to command. Now a slave, a piece of property, was refusing her orders and claiming authority over her dogs. "Thibaut, send the men down. Drag her up." Thibaut hesitated. "Ma'am, if we go down there, those dogs will attack. I'm certain of it. They're bluffing. They're weak from hunger. 6 men with poles can easily control 8 starving animals and 1 defiant slave." But as the men approached the trapdoor with their poles, prepared to descend, something happened that would be reported identically by all 5 men and by Thibault himself in the days following. The dogs stood as one, their movements synchronized, their bodies positioning between the ladder and Marguerite with military precision. Bourbon stepped forward, his massive head lowering, his lips pulling back to show teeth in a snarl that communicated absolute commitment to violence. Behind him, the other 7 dogs arranged themselves in a formation that left no gaps, no vulnerabilities, no way to reach Marguerite without going through them. The first man to put his foot on the ladder, a field hand named Baptiste who'd worked with dogs his entire life, took one look at Bourbon's expression and stepped back. "I'm not going down there, Mom. That dog will kill anyone who tries. Then we'll starve them out longer. Close the door. No food, no water, nothing. We'll wait until they're too weak to resist." "Begging your pardon, ma'am," Thibault said quietly, "but it's been a week already. If starvation was going to break whatever's happening down there, it would have happened by now." The Baroness whirled on him, her face contorted with rage. "Are you defying me too? Are you joining the mutiny? Because I can replace an overseer as easily as I can replace a slave. I'm simply observing that your strategy isn't working." "Then what do you suggest? What would you do?" Thibault looked down into the cellar, at the girl and the dogs, at the impossible alliance that had formed in darkness and desperation. He was a cruel man by profession and nature, but he was also pragmatic, and he recognized when a situation had moved beyond his experience. "I'd let her up, ma'am. Let her up with the dogs, see what happens in open space." "Absolutely not. That would be conceding defeat." "With respect, ma'am, defeat has already occurred. The question is whether we acknowledge it or let it escalate into something worse." The Baroness stood frozen with indecision, her entire worldview crashing against the reality of the scene below her. She'd designed the perfect punishment, the perfect lesson in submission, and it had transformed into something that undermined everything she believed about power and hierarchy and control. Then Marguerite spoke again from below, her voice stronger now, carrying an authority that seemed impossible from someone in her position. "I'm coming up. The dogs are coming with me. You can close that door and keep us locked down here until we all die, which won't take much longer, or you can step back and let us out. Either way, you've already lost. How dare you? You wanted to break me. You wanted to extinguish whatever you saw in my eyes that offended you. You tried every punishment you could imagine, and when that failed, you tried to have me killed in the most horrific way you could devise, but I'm still here. I'm still myself, and these dogs know what you are now just as clearly as I do." The Baroness raised the pistol, pointing it down into the cellar. Her hand shook with rage or fear or both. "I could shoot you right now. End this absurd defiance with a single bullet. You could. But then you'd have 8 starving dogs with no reason left to restrain themselves in a cellar with only one exit, and that exit leads through 6 men who are already terrified to go down there. Pull that trigger and see what happens next." It was a bluff, or maybe it wasn't. The dogs certainly looked ready to respond to gunfire with violence, their bodies coiled with tension, their eyes fixed on the Baroness with an intensity that made several of the assembled men step further back. The Baroness's hand shook harder. Her finger touched the trigger. The moment stretched, taut as a wire ready to snap toward bloodshed. Just when we thought this standoff couldn't become more intense, something happened that no one could have predicted. If you're on the edge of your seat right now, good, because you need to hear this next part. The Baroness's decision in the next 30 seconds would determine not just who lived and who died, but would reshape the power dynamics of the entire plantation. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this is where the story takes a turn that contemporary accounts described as impossible and contrary to all natural law. Let's find out what happened when the Baroness's absolute authority collided with something stronger than fear. Thibault made the decision for her. The overseer stepped forward and put his hand on the Baroness's arm, gently but firmly lowering the pistol. "Ma'am, please. If you shoot that girl, we'll all die in this building. Let me handle this." The Baroness turned on him with fury in her eyes, but something in Thibaud's expression, a combination of fear and resignation, made her hesitate. He'd been managing difficult situations for 3 decades, and she'd hired him specifically for his experience with potential violence. If he was advocating retreat, perhaps she needed to listen. "Fine," she said finally, her voice tight. "Get her up here." "But she's to be restrained immediately and the dog separated from her." Thibaud nodded, though he had no intention of following those orders. He approached the trap door opening and called down, his voice carefully neutral. "Marguerite, I'm going to step back. You can come up with the dogs. No one will interfere. Once you're up, we'll discuss what happens next." From below, Marguerite studied him, trying to read whether this was genuine or another trap. The dogs remained tense around her, waiting for her signal. Finally, she gave a small nod and began moving toward the ladder. What happened next would be described by 7 witnesses with remarkable consistency, despite the inherent impossibility of what they claimed to see. Marguerite climbed the ladder slowly, her movements careful, her body obviously weakened by the ordeal. As she climbed, the dogs began climbing behind her, using the ladder with surprising agility for their size. They didn't rush, didn't crowd, but ascended in order. Bourbon first, then Windsor, then the others in a sequence that seemed predetermined. Marguerite emerged into the kennel building, standing in morning light for the first time in a week. She looked like a ghost, her clothes hanging loose, her skin pale where it wasn't covered in dirt, her hair wild and matted. But her eyes, those eyes that had so enraged the Baroness, held steady and clear. She stepped away from the trap door, and the dogs emerged behind her, forming immediately into that same protective circle. The Baroness and the assembled men had backed up to give space, pressing against the far wall of the kennel building. The Baroness still held the pistol, but her arm had dropped to her side. She stared at Marguerite with an expression that mixed hatred, disbelief, and something that might have been the first hint of fear. "What are you?" The Baroness's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I'm exactly what you tried to destroy. I'm someone who refuses to break." Marguerite's voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by anger that had been building for 2 years. "You bought me because I was cheap, because some fool in Virginia thought defiance made me worthless. You tried to break me with work, with whipping, with starvation, with humiliation. When that failed, you tried to have me killed. But I'm still here, and I'm still whole. And now these dogs understand something you never could." What? What could they possibly understand? That cruelty isn't strength. That fear isn't loyalty. That we're all just survival to you, pieces on a board, tools to be used and discarded. They spent years learning to fear you, to submit to you, to see you as the ultimate authority. Then they spent 4 days in that cellar with someone who treated them like fellow prisoners instead of weapons, and they made their choice. The Baroness laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "You think you've won something? You think this changes anything? They're dogs, you're a slave, and I'm the law on this property. This will end with you back in chains, and them back in their runs, and life will continue exactly as it was." "No, it won't." Marguerite took a step forward. The dogs moved with her, their formation maintaining. "Because everyone here has seen what happened. Everyone knows you tried to have me killed, that you failed, that your authority over your own animals has been broken. How long before the field workers hear about this? How long before every slave on this plantation realizes that your power isn't absolute? How long before someone else refuses an order and you have to confront the fact that fear only works when people believe you're invincible?" The Baroness's face went through a series of expressions before settling on cold rage. "Thibaud, take her. Now, use whatever force is necessary." But Thibaud didn't move. Neither did any of the other men. They looked at Marguerite, at the dogs around her, at the impossible scene playing out in front of them. And they recognized that something fundamental had shifted. The Baroness's power relied on the certainty of her superiority, on the absolute nature of her authority. That certainty had shattered in the past week, and everyone in the building could feel it. "This is mutiny," the Baroness said, her voice rising. "This is insurrection. I'll have you all prosecuted, I'll have you all—" She never finished the sentence. Marguerite took another step forward, and this time the Baroness stepped back, retreating from a slave and 8 dogs she'd once controlled absolutely. That single step backward communicated everything. The Baroness had blinked first, had shown fear, had conceded in the most visible way possible that the dynamic had changed. Marguerite walked toward the door of the kennel building. The dogs followed. The assembled men parted to let them pass, pressing themselves against the walls, their eyes wide. The Baroness stood frozen, the pistol still hanging at her side, her mouth working but producing no sound. At the doorway, Marguerite paused and looked back. "I'm leaving. I'm walking off this plantation, and these dogs are coming with me. You can try to stop me, which means shooting me in the back in front of witnesses, or you can let me go. Either way, everyone here will know what happened in that cellar, and they'll know you lost. You won't make it 10 miles, the Baroness said, her voice shaking. They'll catch you before nightfall. They'll bring you back in chains, and when they do, I'll make what you've experienced seem like mercy. Maybe, but I'd rather die free than live as your property. And I think you know, I'm not the only one on this plantation who feels that way." Marguerite walked out into the morning. The 8 dogs followed in formation, their bodies surrounding hers, their eyes scanning for threats. The assembled men watched from the doorway as she crossed the yard, past the main house, and headed toward the long road that led away from the estate. The Baroness stood paralyzed for perhaps 30 seconds, her mind racing through scenarios, through consequences, through the mathematics of power and control. Then she raised the pistol and fired. The shot went wide, intentionally or not, embedding itself in a tree 20 feet to Marguerite's right. The sound echoed across the plantation, bringing field workers and house staff running from various buildings. They arrived to see Marguerite walking steadily toward the road, dogs surrounding her, the Baroness standing in the kennel doorway with a smoking pistol, and Thibault holding the Baroness's arm to prevent her from firing again. "Let her go," Thibault was saying. "For God's sake, let her go before this becomes murder." But the Baroness wasn't listening. She was watching Marguerite's retreating form, watching the dogs that had once been her most prized possessions following a slave instead of their owner, watching the visible proof of her failure to break someone's will. Her face had gone beyond rage into something colder, more calculated. "Fine," she said quietly. "Let her go. Let her think she's won. But this isn't over. Send word to the parish authorities. Report her as a runaway. Offer a reward. She'll be caught before sunset, and when she returns, we'll see how defiant she remains." Thibault released her arm and stepped back, relief visible on his face that the immediate crisis had passed without more bloodshed. The other men began dispersing, heading back to their various duties, already beginning to construct the stories they'd tell about what they'd witnessed. The Baroness watched Marguerite until she disappeared from sight around a bend in the road, then turned and walked toward the main house, her back rigid, her pace measured and controlled. What happened in the house over the following hours would be pieced together later from the testimony of house staff. The Baroness retired to her chambers immediately, dismissing the servants who approached to ask if she needed anything. She remained there through the morning and into the afternoon, the door locked, no sounds emerging from within. At one point, the cook brought a lunch tray and left it outside the door. Hours later, it remained untouched. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, one of the housemaids noticed smoke coming from under the Baroness's door. She called for help, and Thibault came running with several field hands. They broke down the door to find the Baroness lying on her bed, perfectly composed, her hands folded across her chest. She was dead, and the room showed no signs of struggle or violence. The parish doctor, summoned immediately, examined the body and pronounced death by heart failure. The cook, when questioned, admitted that the Baroness had requested a particular tea that morning before retiring to her chambers, a tea made from plants the Baroness grew herself in a small garden behind the house. The doctor examined the remaining tea leaves and found them mixed with quantities of foxglove and monkshood, both deadly in sufficient concentration. The official record, entered into the parish register on May 22, 1847, recorded simply, Eloise Devereaux, aged 41 years, died of heart failure at her residence. No suspicious circumstances noted. The entry was signed by Dr. Pierre Marchand, the local magistrate Jean-Baptiste Hébert, and Gaspard Thibault as witness. But unofficial accounts, the kind whispered between neighbors and recorded in private journals, told a different story. The Baroness had killed herself rather than face the humiliation of what had occurred, rather than live with the knowledge that her absolute authority had been broken by someone she considered beneath humanity. She'd poisoned herself with plants from her own garden, plants she'd been cultivating for purposes no one dared speculate about openly. And she'd done it with the same cold calculation she'd applied to every other aspect of her life. The plantation itself, as mentioned in the opening, was burned to the ground within a week. The official story claimed an accident with a lamp in the main house that spread before anyone could contain it. But the field workers and house staff knew better. The fire had been set deliberately, started in multiple locations simultaneously, by people who'd lived under the Baroness's cruelty and saw the destruction of her physical legacy as a form of justice. The fate of Marguerite, after she walked off the Devereaux estate, remains a subject of historical mystery, which is perhaps fitting. No runaway notices matching her description appear in any Louisiana newspaper from the period. No parish records document her capture or return. She simply vanished from official documentation, leaving only the accounts of what she'd survived and the impossibility of what she'd accomplished. 3 letters, now housed in the Louisiana Historical Collection in Baton Rouge, provide the only substantive documentation of what happened after she left the plantation. All 3 were written by neighboring planters to relatives in other states, all dated within 2 weeks of the incident, and all describe essentially the same scene. A young woman walking north along the river road, accompanied by 8 large dogs, refusing all offers of assistance or challenge, moving with a purpose that made even armed men reluctant to interfere. One letter, from a planter named Adolphe Landry to his brother in Natchez, describes encountering Marguerite at a crossroads. She appeared as one who had passed through fire and emerged transformed. The dogs about her moved with military precision, and her bearing carried an authority I have seen in generals, but never in one of her station. I inquired if she required assistance, thinking her perhaps lost or separated from her owner. She fixed me with a look that made me regret the question and replied simply, "I am exactly where I need to be." The dogs positioned themselves between us, not threateningly but with clear intent, and I found myself stepping aside to let them pass. I watched until they disappeared toward the north, and I confess, I felt relief to see them go. The dogs themselves provide an additional mystery. 8 valuable hunting animals, each worth substantial money, simply disappeared from Louisiana. No bills of sale exist for them, no transfer of ownership, no advertisement seeking their return. They left with Marguerite and vanished into history, their ultimate fate as unknown as hers. The Devereaux estate, after the fire, was sold at auction to settle the Baroness's debts. The land was divided among 3 buyers, the buildings never reconstructed. Within a generation, the former plantation had been absorbed into neighboring properties, its boundaries erased, its history forgotten by anyone who didn't have reason to remember. The cellar beneath the kennels, where the impossible alliance had formed, was filled in and plowed over, its location now unmarked and unknown. But the story of what happened there didn't disappear entirely. It survived in the oral traditions of the enslaved community, passing from generation to generation as both historical account and parable. Elderly former slaves interviewed in the 1930s by the Federal Writers Project occasionally referenced a "girl and the dogs" story. Though details varied and dates shifted, and the location moved across different states depending on who was telling it, the core remained consistent. Someone who'd been reduced to property, who was supposed to be broken, who had survived something intended to kill her, and emerged with power her oppressor could never understand. Gaspar Thibault, the overseer, left Louisiana within a month of the Baroness's death. He moved to Texas, took work on a cattle ranch, and died in 1851 in a riding accident. His journal, discovered among his effects and eventually donated to a historical society, provides the most detailed first-hand account of the events at the Devereaux estate. He wrote extensively about what he'd witnessed, trying to make sense of it, trying to explain to himself how a starving girl had commanded starving dogs through nothing but will and shared suffering. His final entry, dated 3 days before his death, circles back to the incident. I have seen much cruelty in my profession, have participated in much that I am not proud of. But what the Baroness attempted exceeded all bounds of decent behavior, even by the standards of our brutal institution. What the girl accomplished exceeded all bounds of natural law. I will die not understanding it, and perhaps that is fitting punishment for the role I played. The legal implications of the incident remained deliberately unexplored. The parish authorities, faced with a situation that challenged multiple foundational assumptions about power and control and hierarchy, chose to record the minimum necessary and move forward as if nothing unusual had occurred. The Baroness's death was ruled natural causes, the fire was ruled accidental, and Marguerite's disappearance was never officially investigated. To dig deeper would require acknowledging that the entire system of slavery, built on the assumption of absolute racial hierarchy and the permanence of submission, had been fundamentally challenged by one woman and 8 dogs in a cellar. 3 enslaved people from the Devereaux estate gained their freedom in 1848, purchased or granted manumission by the estate's executors as part of settling debts and closing accounts. Their names appear in parish records: Baptiste, the field hand who'd refused to enter the cellar; Marie-Louise, the cook who'd prepared the Baroness's final tea; and Thomas, a houseman who'd been the first to notice the smoke from the Baroness's chambers. Whether their freedom was coincidence, or whether they'd earned it through their responses during the crisis, the records don't indicate. The broader historical context makes Marguerite's story even more remarkable. This occurred in 1847, 2 years before Harriet Tubman's first rescue mission, 14 years before the Civil War, in a region where slavery's grip was absolute and resistance usually met with immediate, overwhelming violence. For someone in Marguerite's position to survive, let alone to walk away with 8 valuable animals, required circumstances so unusual, so precisely aligned, that her story risks seeming fictional despite the documentary evidence. Yet the evidence exists. The letters describing her walking north, Thibault's journal, the parish records of the Baroness's death and the fire, the freedom papers for the 3 formerly enslaved people, and the persistent oral tradition that kept the story alive through generations. Each piece individually proves little, but together they construct a narrative that challenges comfortable assumptions about power and hierarchy and the permanence of oppression. The dogs, perhaps, provide the most profound element of the story. They were bred to dominate, trained to respond only to force and fear, kept in a state of perpetual hunger to make them more dangerous. Yet when placed in circumstances where they shared suffering with someone who treated them as fellow prisoners rather than weapons, they formed a loyalty that superseded their training. They chose solidarity over cruelty, chose to protect rather than destroy, chose to follow someone who'd shown them empathy rather than someone who'd shown them power. That choice, witnessed by multiple people and documented in contemporary accounts, remains the element that most challenges explanation. Animal behaviorists examining historical accounts of the incident note that while pack bonding can occur under stress, the speed and completeness of the dog's loyalty shift exceeds normal parameters. The most honest assessment, offered by Dr. Sarah Merchant in a 2003 paper examining the incident, concluded, either the contemporary accounts were exaggerated to the point of fiction, or something occurred in that cellar that revealed capacities for interspecies empathy and communication that we still don't fully understand. The most haunting element of the story remains its deliberate erasure from official records. Someone, probably multiple people, made conscious decisions to minimize documentation of what occurred, to rule the Baroness's death natural causes when it clearly wasn't, to let Marguerite disappear without pursuit, to allow 8 valuable dogs to vanish without investigation. These decisions reveal the threat the incident posed to the entire system. If one enslaved woman could refuse authority absolutely, could form an alliance with animals meant to intimidate her, could walk away from bondage and have that escape tacitly permitted by authorities, what did that say about the claimed permanence of racial hierarchy? Better, those authorities must have decided to let it disappear, to record the minimum necessary and move on, to treat it as an aberration rather than a revelation. But stories don't disappear just because officials want them to. They survive in whispers, in oral traditions, in letters tucked away in private collections, in journals that surface decades later. They survive because they need to survive, because they contain truths that can't be comfortably acknowledged, but also can't be entirely suppressed. What do you think really happened in that cellar during those 4 days? Was it simply survival instinct, a desperate gamble that happened to work? Was it something deeper, some capacity for empathy and connection that transcends species and circumstances? Could Marguerite have understood something about power and authority that the Baroness, for all her education and privilege, never grasped? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. This story challenges everything we think we understand about power dynamics, about resistance, about what becomes possible when someone refuses to accept the role they've been assigned. If you made it to the end of this account, you've journeyed through one of the most disturbing and inexplicable incidents in American history, a story that was deliberately suppressed but never entirely erased. Subscribe to this channel for more forgotten histories and mysteries that challenge our understanding of the past. Hit the notification bell so you never miss when we uncover another story that should have been lost to time but refuses to disappear. Share this video with anyone who appreciates history's darkest and most inexplicable corners. And most importantly, keep questioning, keep digging, keep refusing to accept the sanitized versions of the past. Because somewhere in Louisiana, a young woman walked away from slavery with 8 dogs following her, and no one in authority could bring themselves to stop her. That impossible moment, that crack in the foundation of an entire system of oppression, matters more than any official record that tried to erase it. See you in the next mystery.